I'm David Culver in Beijing, and this is CNN.
Live from CNN London, this is Connect the World with Becky Anderson.
This hour, outrage as Russian missiles strike Odessa port one day after a grain export deal was agreed, a move that Ukraine's foreign ministry denounced as a spit in the face. Welcome back to the show. Beyond countless dead and maimed, beyond obliterated buildings and towns, Russia's war on Ukraine has also pushed many people around the world closer to starvation. Now, however, Ukraine says it could be just days away from moving out millions of tons of grain that's been blocked at its ports. Under a deal with Russia, ships loaded with grain would travel through a, quote, safe corridor in the Black Sea, then through Turkey's Bosphorus Strait and onto global markets. The agreement, though, seemed in doubt after Russian strikes on that key port city of Odessa over the weekend. CNN's Nick Robertson is in Kyiv in Ukraine with more on what's going on behind the scenes with this deal. What do we know at this point?
Well, the next step in this deal are really the implementation. There's a joint coordination center to be established in Istanbul that will oversee how this UN brokered deal works, make sure that the inspections happen in the right places, that the word of the deal is held to. And I spoke with Ukraine's infrastructure minister a short time ago, who was the person who signed the deal for Ukraine in Istanbul on Friday. And he told me they've sent a team today to be at that joint center. So that's underway. They're making the preparations in their ports to get the grain out. They hope to be in a position and have the whole system in place in the next few days, by the end of the week, he said, to actually get the grain exported. But on these issues of the Russian missile strike, and actually the words of the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, following that, saying Russia actually has the right to target military infrastructure in Odessa, that there's nothing in this UN brokered deal that will stop them doing that. Despite this kind of language, despite the despite the missiles actually being fired, he feels that it can work, although there are, again, points that Russia is contesting. Sergei Lavrov is saying that Russian ships will escort these cargo vessels through the Black Sea. Ukraine's infrastructure minister is saying that's not part of the deal, and it's not going to happen.
So we won't allow to do this. Our territorial waters and our seaports, only Ukraine and Ukrainian Navy will be there. So if you're talking about like inspections and all these issues, it will be near Turkey, it will be near Bosphorus, and will be led by Turkey and by United Nations.
So no Russian ships escorting the convoys anywhere along the convoy?
No ships at all in this process.
So these very real tensions exist, but from Ukraine's perspective, the most important thing is to try to push through, to try to get this grain out, to try to get it to the needy in the world. Also, it means revenue and income for them, as much as $1 billion a month, potentially, Becky.
Yeah, Nick Robertson's on the story for you. Nick, thank you. Well, it's important to note that in the immediate aftermath of Russia's weekend attack on Odessa, and that is a key principal port in what was this UN brokered deal, Russia told Turkey's defense minister it wasn't responsible. The Kremlin later retracting that denial, claiming it was targeting military infrastructure, as you just heard Nick reporting there. And today, Russia's foreign minister said the grain deal would not prohibit military strikes on Odessa. This latest posturing, again, bringing up the point, can Russia be trusted? Well, I want to talk about that and Turkey's very important role in the ongoing diplomacy in all of this with Ibrahim Kalin, spokesperson for the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. He joins me from Ankara. It's good to have you, Ibrahim. Less than 24 hours after the grain corridor agreement signed in Turkey, Russian missiles hit the Black Sea port of Odessa. Russia now admitting those missiles were theirs, earlier insisting to Turkey they weren't. How can Russia be trusted at this point, sir?
Well, first of all, of course, we urge all sides to stick to the agreement that we all signed on Saturday. And that, of course, includes the provision not to conduct any kind of military attacks and not to prevent the flow of grain exports, both from Ukraine and from Russia. So we've raised this issue with the Russians. We have spoken to the Ukrainians. And I want to actually thank the Ukrainian leadership, President Zelensky, his aide, Andrei Yermak, and others who were very responsible and positive and constructive in their approach. Of course, this kind of attacks must be avoided, and we will be monitoring this very closely. We will be raising this issue with the Russians, but also it shows how difficult it is to have any kind of agreement under the current circumstances. At least we have this agreement, which will be, of course, good, as you have pointed out, for global food security. But every step of the way, we will be very careful, monitoring and watching the whole situation, and we'll remain in very close contact with both Russian and Ukrainian officials.
Ibrahim Kalin, US officials have said they are deeply concerned by the Odessa attack. I hear what you've just said, but I must press you on this. Can the Russians be trusted, to your mind, at this point? After all, the initial response to those attacks was a lie from the Russians.
They made some conflicting reports and statements at the beginning. That is true. When we received the news of the attack, we immediately contacted them. And to be honest with you, our defense minister spoke to Minister Shoigu, and he really did not get a full kind of a detailed response or explanation from. I think they were trying to figure out what exactly happened there, because it will have been strange, I mean, for Defense Minister Shoigu, right? I mean, to sign this agreement and then, less than 24 hours later, having this kind of attack. I mean, that will shadow what he achieved also on the part of Russia. So, I mean, issue of trust, of course, is very important, as you have pointed out. I think that is, one of the most difficult issues at the moment, not only in regards to the grain issue, but say on any ceasefire, prison exchange, or any other peace negotiations. The main issue is lack of trust. There is a war going on. Ukraine is under occupation, and we fully understand Ukraine's frustration and suspicion vis-a-vis, the Russian intentions and actions, and that of the international community as well. But the only way to overcome this is this, constant, repeated effort, as we've tried to do over the last 5, 6, 7 weeks to reach this agreement. Implementation phase will not be any different. It will be difficult. It will be very meticulous work. It will be, challenging on many different fronts. And so, I mean, it's not a given, of course. If we can just make a general statement whether this side or that side can be trusted or not, we just have to go step by step.
I interviewed Antonio Guterres immediately after the deal was signed on Friday. It was Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, sitting side by side with your president as that deal was signed. And look, he talked about the fact that this had been months in the making, and much of this going on behind closed doors, away from the media, and rightly so. And the Turkish involvement at this point, of course, has been absolutely admirable. But I asked Antonio Guterres on Friday if there were clear mechanisms in place to hold Russia accountable if it were to violate what is this incredibly important deal to get foodstuffs out to the parts of the world that need them so much. Have a listen to what he told me.
I believe it is in the mutual interest of the parties because this will represent not only an important solution for the Ukraine that has all the silos full and the new harvest being made, so it's vital to export Ukrainian grains. But we are working also, as it is known, with the US and with the EU. The US has already issued a statement in relation to this. There are no sanctions on food and fertilizers, and so Russian food and fertilizers will also be able to be in access to the world markets. And these two combined operations will mean a huge injection that I believe will bring prices down, will stabilize the markets.
And he makes a really important point, Ibrahim Kalin, doesn't he? He says it's in the interest of both parties to ensure that this deal is implemented efficiently and effectively. From your conversation with the Russians, and you keep an open dialogue with the Russians, and you and I have talked about this now for, 6 months since this war began. Do you believe that that's reason enough for them to not put this agreement, this deal, in jeopardy?
Well, given the fact that it's Russia's self-interest that has brought them to this agreement, of course, with a lot of diplomacy behind the closed doors, as you pointed out, we've been working on this for months, really, without much media attention, because there were so many different aspects to it, and it required a lot of discreet diplomacy and negotiations and talks and meetings, etc. But at the end of the day, it's also in Russia's interest, because even though there is no embargo or sanctions on Russian agricultural products, they were not able to get their grain out because, number one, international companies were not insuring Russian ships. Number two, they did not have any assurances from the international community, other countries that impose sanctions on Russia, that their ships will not be stopped or confiscated. And now there is an assurance as part of this agreement. So it's also in their interest. By the way, getting Russian agricultural products, fertilizers, ammo, and other things is also in the interest of the global markets in terms of food security. So it's not only the Ukrainian grain, but also the Russian grain, which actually is higher in quantity than that of Ukraine. So both are needed actually for the international markets and food prices. So it's in their interest as well. And we believe they will, from now on, implement, this is at least what we hear from their side, that they will implement the agreement. There will not be any intervention in terms of the exports of grain ships, traveling and monitoring, etc., will be conducted from the Joint Cooperation Center in Istanbul. And that center will have representatives from both countries, as well as from Turkey and the UN. I believe once we set this up, in fact, it's being set up as we speak, and we are hoping that the first ships will start sailing in the next couple of weeks. Sooner the better, of course, but it really depends on how quickly Russian and the Ukrainian sides will be ready to start sending their ships. But I think once we have this traffic moving, things will be, I think, in order. Hopefully, this attack on Saturday was just one isolated incident. We hope. But of course, we do not base our actions only on hope. We continue our meticulous diplomacy engagement with the Russian and the Ukrainian sides. I'm positive, despite that hiccup, despite that attack, which is uncalled for. I'm hopeful for the future.
And I hear your response to that. Look, you were just talking about ensuring that this traffic is on the move within the next couple of days. Let's just talk about the sort of how that's going to work. Who and how is that traffic from Ukrainian ports going to be secured in what we are reporting will be a, quote, safe corridor through the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus Strait, and then onto global markets? You've talked about the centre in Istanbul. Can you provide us a little bit more detail about what you understand to be the process? Because the Ukrainians have certainly told Nick Robertson, and our viewers heard that a little bit earlier on, they do not expect that traffic to be secured by Russian ships ever.
No, certainly. The control of Ukrainian ships going in, going out will be under Ukrainian control. Ships going into ports in Odessa will be inspected in Istanbul by this joint committee, not by just Russians or by us, but by this committee that will have, as I said, Ukrainian, Russian, Turkish, and UN officials there. When they come out, the same process, and it will be controlled as far as the ships are concerned coming from Odessa port. It will be controlled by the Ukrainians themselves. That's kind of part of their national sovereignty, of course, and it is very clearly stated in the agreement that the Russian ships, warships or others, will not come near Ukrainian shores during this operation, and the Ukraine and the Russians have signed up to respect that rule, and so that will how it will be implemented. In terms of the safe corridors, those were actually determined and conveyed to us by the Ukrainians themselves. As you know, they mine the Odessa port. It's actually a big area, and it's their main access to the Black Sea, because after they lost their access to the city of Mariupol, they lost their access to the city of Azov. Therefore, their only access to the sea is through the Odessa port, and so they mined Odessa port for security reasons. And demining will have been too complicated, too difficult, but also I understand that they don't want to demine the entire Odessa area, fearing that the Russians may try to go in. Therefore,
Understood.
they actually themselves specified these corridors. There are 3 main corridors with all the coordinates that have been communicated to us, to the UN, and to those ships that will be sailing. And they will actually guide them through those corridors. If there is any
Right.
need for demining, then that will be done by the Ukrainian side. If they need any help from us, say from Turkey or from any other country, we'll be ready to help them with clearing these corridors. But so far, it looks like they will be able to manage it themselves.
Your explanation really flushes out just how complicated and fragile this is. We can only hope, as you have rightly suggested, that this holds, and the behaviour of the Russians over the weekend is a one-off. Just before you and I, though, began speaking, news that Russia's Gazprom will halt one more turbine at what is a strategically important Nord Stream 1 pipeline. The result would be a reduction in gas flows into Europe. And it's that sort of behaviour that makes people sceptical of Russia's promises. I don't know whether you heard that news before you and I started talking. I wonder whether you can just get me a response to that and speak to that kind of wider scepticism of Russia's promises at this point.
Well, I mean, right now we are in this cycle of action, reaction, response, counter-response, and I think everybody is playing with the instruments that they have, whatever weapons they think they can use against the other side using. So Russia is using the gas weapon, energy weapon, against European countries that impose sanctions on it, and so vice versa. I mean, Europeans stop, they sanctioned a lot of Russian entities, companies, and products, etc. They said they will no longer buy gas from Russia, and Russia, in response, said, "Okay, let's see how far they can go with this," and then they cut it. And I think we will see this play out in the months to come, as long as this conflict continues. That's why we're calling on all sides to come to the negotiating table. I don't want to sound too optimistic here, but this grain agreement actually may lay the foundations for the kind of trust that we were talking about earlier. That may lead to a resumption of ceasefire talks, prisoner exchange, and perhaps eventually to a peace agreement. I know it's too early to say this at this point, but if we can build on this agreement, the grain agreement, and given the fact that this war is destructive on all counts. It's bad for Ukraine, it's bad for Russia, it's bad for the world, for energy markets, for global food markets, for everybody. We really have to find to bring an end to this fighting, to this conflict.
Yeah.
How we do it requires, of course, a lot of careful diplomacy, patient diplomacy, and I'm hoping, and in fact, I want to call out the international community. Not just simply congratulate the agreement that was signed in Istanbul 2 days ago, but try to build on it through positive action by trying to reach out to all possible ways to not only implement the grain agreement, but also bring an end to this conflict so that Ukrainian lands are no longer occupied. They no longer lose people. The Russians also stop their attacks.
Understood.
And, we somehow find a way to bring this conflict to an end.
I hear what you're saying. I'm sure that many people share your optimism, although, and you were caveating this by saying this may be slightly too early to suggest that we are close to any sort of peace agreement here. But you're making a very good point. Look, I've just got a couple of other questions, and I need to get these in briefly. Last week, President Erdogan renewed his threat to freeze the process of NATO membership for Sweden and Finland after conditionally agreeing to green-light their bid. Do those two countries have Turkey's support for NATO membership? Can we be quite clear about this?
Our agreement is very clear. It really is dependent on how much or what kind of action they will be taking during this ratification process, because we have said yes and approved their application to become a member in NATO. There is a process still. There is a national ratification process. for other countries, but more specifically vis-a-vis Turkey for us, there are specific conditions that we laid out, and those involve taking steps to address Turkey's security concerns. And as Sweden has promised, both publicly and also in the agreement, but also public statements have been made about this, that we are still expecting the extradition or expulsion of PKK-related, PYD, YPG-related people.
Were those
from
conditional,
Sweden.
sir, in that agreement, in agreeing to support membership? Were those conditional?
Yes, of course. We made it very clear from the very beginning that these are conditional. I mean,
Okay.
these conditions have to be met before, their full membership is
All right.
ratified by us.
Ibrahim Kalin, thank you for your time. Your time today is extremely important. Your analysis and insight into what is going on is crucial for our wider understanding of the situation, which, of course, has got massive global implications. Thank you, sir. Well, just there, the leader of the Catholic Church wants the Indigenous people of Canada to know that he is sorry. The Pope's pilgrimage of penance is next. And the condemnations pour in after Myanmar's military government executes prominent pro-democracy activists. That after this.
Tech for space.
There's a space environmentalist living inside of everybody.
Tech for clean air.
Because what we're talking about here is a global problem.
Tech for quiet.
We are using some AI technologies to mitigate intruding noise.
This is Tech for Good.
Join me as I meet the minds behind the technologies that could help in the battle against invisible pollution.
Tech for Good, Saturday on CNN, in association with Samsung.
I was trafficked at the age of 18. I was a single young mom trying to figure out how to put myself through school. I was lured off of a college campus in Eugene, Oregon, and I was trafficked to Las Vegas mainly for nearly 6 years. My name's Rebecca Bender, and I'm the CEO and founder of the Rebecca Bender Initiative. The way that we mentor survivors of human trafficking is through our initiative called the Elevate Academy. Elevate Academy is really a holistic school that invites survivors to join a cohort of other people just like them. They get a mentor, they get a life coach. We help take them through a number of classes, some of which are really about deeper levels of healing. When I was able to finally escape from my trafficker, I can remember during that time I had been traded and sold between 3 different traffickers. I had 2 men tattoo their names on my back like a piece of cattle. I have been to jail multiple times, had my face broken in 5 places. I was really hopeless and I didn't know how I was going to get out. Finally, a federal investigation led to my trafficker's arrest, and I went home to a family that was really supportive. But we know in this fight against trafficking that that's not the case for everybody. So not only am I really grateful, but I'm also really determined to help communities learn how to be that family for survivors that are trying to rebuild their lives.
Well, a journey of penance to try to make peace with the past. Pope Francis has travelled to Edmonton in Canada, where he is set to meet with Indigenous leaders and give an address in the next hour, all in the name of forgiveness. His trip comes as the Catholic Church tries to atone for decades of abuse against Indigenous children in Canada. CNN's Paula Newton joining us now live from Edmonton. Paula.
Becky, great anticipation for this visit. And remember, as you were just indicating, this has a singular purpose. It is unlike any other papal visit. And as you were saying, the Pope will atone for what happened here. And the issue, Becky, is not just the individual stories that are horrific enough of abuse at the hands of priests, nuns, and other Catholic staff at these institutions, but the fact that a commission here in Canada in 2015 determined that what the Catholic Church did amounted to cultural genocide. Take a listen.
It is a papal trip like no other, one that will see Pope Francis humble himself on behalf of the Catholic Church and apologize to Canada's Indigenous peoples for years of abuse and harm. Only months ago, few could imagine his journey here, one the Pope is calling a journey of penance. for what a Canadian National Commission says was cultural genocide. At least 150,000 Indigenous children separated from their families and forced to attend residential institutions where thousands endured physical, sexual, and emotional abuse from priests, nuns, and school staff.
Kneel down the way you made us kneel down as little kids and ask for that forgiveness.
Victoria McIntosh was taken from her family at the age of 4.
My grands made this for me.
This was the coat she says she wore when her mom dropped her off at a Catholic institution in Manitoba in the 1960s.
That nun took it off of me and threw it at my mom.
McIntosh said the nun then called her mother a savage, an incident she said foreshadowed years of abuse. She says her mother never forgave herself.
And I told her, I said, it's not your fault. It wasn't your fault. What choice did you have?
McIntosh says she was sexually assaulted by a priest for years when she was only a child.
He violated me in ways that no child should ever go through. And I would break down and I would cry thinking about it, what he'd done. And I wonder why. What did I do to you?
McIntosh says that priest was 92-year-old Arthur Massé. It was only in June when he was charged with indecent assault. He has not entered a plea. And it is the impunity of the Catholic Church's actions that hangs over this visit, even as dozens of Indigenous communities now search the grounds of these institutions, where hundreds of unmarked graves have already been identified. As Indigenous communities work to recover their lost children, there is still much ambivalence about the Pope's visit and his apology. The Pope was blunt. He called it a journey of penance.
I don't know. That's interesting interpretation of it, right? You know, for me, it's not a journey, right? It was more than a journey for our people, I think, and the journey will never end, right? It's going to be there forever.
Pope Francis says he acknowledges that, but hopes this historic gesture of atonement will bring some measure of relief and healing. You know, Becky, you heard Chief Henderson there say that it was going to be here forever, and I want to introduce to you the concept of intergenerational trauma. It is something we have heard for decades here in Canada. The fact that these elders who, with such grace, speak to us about the really torturous conditions in which they lived, the way they were taken away from families, the way they were not taught to love and even have affection or give affection, that has affected so many generations of Indigenous peoples in this country. And that is why they will be parsing the words of the Pope to come in the next hour. We're looking for a whole apology, a whole of the Catholic Church apology, not just for the actions of individuals.
Yeah. No, Paula, thank you very much indeed. Important story. Well, up next on Connect the World, extreme heat feeds rampaging wildfires. We're on the scene of a blaze threatening thousands of homes in California. And lots of anxiety across the globe after the World Health Organization declared monkeypox a public health emergency. We'll have what you need to know about the virus after this.
Bring the energy.
The Aramco Team Series Soto Grande.
Nerves of steel. Team Buhai have done it in Spain.
3 pros, 1 amateur. Let's go.
As Russia's war on Ukraine enters its 6th month, Ukraine reporting progress, at least in its counter-offensive in the southern Kherson region. A military advisor there saying resistance forces damaged bridges that Russia has been using to supply troops, making the movement of heavy equipment and vehicles very complicated, is his quote for the Russians. Ukraine's president calling it a step-by-step advance. Our senior international correspondent, Ivan Watson, is on the ground for us. He's in Mykolaiv in southern Ukraine. Clearly, in other parts of the country, not as much success for the Ukrainians. But what are you learning at this point about this counteroffensive?
It's a very long front line. It is a grinding conflict. And the Ukrainians do claim to be making some progress. They are having to fight for every inch of land that they are retaking. They say that they have seen a change in the behavior and in the weaponry of the Russians since these long-range Western-supplied rocket and missile systems have been given. The famous American HIMARS that have been able to hit suspected ammunition dumps and command points deep behind enemy lines. I was just meeting with a senior lieutenant who commands about 100 men just 10 kilometers from the Russian front line, and he says that in the last 2 to 3 weeks, the amount of artillery that the Russians were able to throw at his positions has dropped substantially. And remember, the Russians have always vastly outnumbered the Ukrainians when it comes to heavy weaponry, long-range artillery, and armored vehicles as well. So in his words, this was helping save lives. Another clear part of the Ukrainian strategy right now is to hit supply lines. What does that mean? Bridges, basically. That they're using some of this long-range weaponry to hit the bridges that connect Crimea to Russian-occupied Kherson region of southern Ukraine in hopes of making it harder to bring more armored vehicles into this area, to bring in more of this weaponry. That said, the Russians continue to hurl these cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities. They continue to fire the repurposed S-300 surface-to-air missiles at the southern frontline city of Mykolaiv day and night. The Ukrainians claim that they destroyed one of these missile launching systems and even published images of that. So are we about to see massive gains taking place? From what I'm hearing from frontline commanders, no, but they do seem confident. They are moving forward, and I've seen all across this long front line signs of Western weaponry coming into the hands of the Ukrainian troops, be it British Land Rovers that I saw one regiment driving around further to the east of here, or the shoulder-launched anti-tank rockets that I've seen just in the hands just today of other fighters, or the American HIMARS, the high mobility rocket systems, which I've seen traversing roads here in southern Ukraine. It is clear that the Ukrainians have better weaponry now, and it's just now starting to get into the hands of some of these frontline units. Becky.
Ivan Watson's on the ground with the very latest. Ivan, thank you. Well, firefighters in California are battling a huge blaze, as you see here, that exploded in size over the weekend. It is now threatening more than 3,000 homes and businesses near Yosemite National Park. The so-called Oak Fire is being fueled by a record-breaking heat wave that has gripped much of the United States. Today, 60 million people remain across the United States under heat alerts. But for some of them, there may be a little relief on the way. Temperatures dropping closer to normal this week in cities like Boston, New York and Philadelphia. Well, Polo Sandoval is covering the heat wave in the northeastern United States. Camilla Bernal is on the other side of the country near that huge fire in California. And Camilla, let's start with you. Those images from Yosemite, so dramatic. How are people around the area coping?
Well, look, it's not easy because the flames are spreading very quickly, and authorities here are saying that they are spreading so quickly because of the drought, because everything around this area is really dry. You can see it here on the ground, and you can see exactly where that fire crossed into this property. It was also probably very dry. Authorities say that the fire continues to grow. It was about 14,000 acres burned on Saturday, then 15 on Sunday, and now we're close to 17,000 acres burned. Thousands also being forced to evacuate, and unfortunately there are some that are going to come back to properties that look just like this. You see there's still some hot spots here. You can see the cars. Really, there's not a lot left behind in this property, and authorities say that a lot of people in this area live in, say, 5-acre lots, so it's really hard to get to these areas. It's really hard to come back and help people if they choose to stay. Unfortunately, I have to talk to some people who say, look, we don't want to leave. They like to stay near their properties. And so it has been somewhat difficult for authorities to try to get everyone out. Thankfully, though, they have made some progress. Containment is now at 10%, and it doesn't sound like a lot, but over the last couple of days, it's been at 0. So it is some progress. It's the first progress that we've seen since this fire started. Becky?
Yeah, thank you. You can really see the devastation on the ground there. Paulo, let me bring you in. The much-anticipated heat wave now has arrived in the northeast. What's the latest where you are, and what's the forecast, more importantly, going forward?
And Becky, with that weekend now come and gone, there is a sense here throughout the Northeast that the worst of those temperatures, it is behind us. That's because this roughly 30, 31 degrees Celsius is fairly refreshing today compared to what we experienced yesterday. Just consider the records that were reached in major cities like, not just here in New York, but in Boston, in the nearby city of Philadelphia as well. In Newark, New Jersey yesterday, seeing a high of close to 38.5 degrees Celsius. That was for 5 days straight, experiencing that level of high heat. So that is why authorities all weekend long were concerned, encouraging people who live in some of these cities to stay indoors in the air conditioning or to go places like this and find a way to keep cool. And that's precisely what we saw. New Yorkers of all ages trying to find different creative ways of staying cool. In terms of what we expect in the next 24 hours or so, the concern now will be more about severe weather. Now that it seems that the worst of those temperatures is over, a big part of the focus of the United States will now be for states like Washington, Oregon, cities like Seattle and Portland expected to see record-breaking heat right now. But really, this all goes back to what we've heard from geoscientists and weather experts now saying that the level of severe weather, like what we experienced here the last couple of days, it speaks to the climate change impact. It goes beyond this heat wave that appears to be subsiding, but nonetheless did turn deadly for some throughout the United States in places like Arizona and here in New York City, where we saw just one heat-related death over the weekend. Becky?
Yeah, Paulo, thank you. The story stateside for you folks. Up next on Connect the World, Myanmar executes pro-democracy activists in what one country calls a new low point. I'm going to speak next with a documentary filmmaker who investigated 3 mass killings in Myanmar. We look at the forgotten revolution there. That's next.
For too long, we have waited for hours to convert currencies, days to clear checks, and decades to reach our potential. But now, we can access the power of African free trade in an instant with PAPS, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System. Overcome barriers, reduce risks, trade in local currencies, and connect with a single market united across Africa. Be a part of Africa's flourishing free trade today.
share this place. We all belong. We have to restore this planet's soul. Give it water, give it sun, room to grow. I can see a better tomorrow. I can see a better tomorrow.
Well, international outrage building after Myanmar's junta executed 4 people accused, by them at least, of terrorism. 2 of them were pro-democracy leaders. These were Myanmar's first judicial executions in decades, and human rights groups fear there will be more as the military government cracks down on dissent. The US, France and Germany condemning the actions, and the United Nations calls them deeply troubling. Well, the UK's Channel 4 has commissioned a documentary on the brutality in Myanmar. The programme investigates 3 mass killings and shows how the army might have committed war crimes by targeting peaceful protesters. Here's just a sample of Myanmar, the Forgotten Revolution.
For 50 years, Myanmar has been run by its army. After a brief experiment with democracy, they've again seized power. This time in a coup led by Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. Since the coup, almost 20,000 people have reportedly been killed as the military cracks down on dissent. For over a year, we've worked with a network of local journalists who've risked their lives to secretly document the army's brutal repression.
Well, Katie Arnold is the director of that documentary. She used to live in Myanmar and is now a filmmaker and investigative journalist, and it's good to have you here. It's a terrific documentary. Before we talk about the film, what do you make of these horrific executions that we have learned of today?
Well, it's a very worrying development because the 4 activists that were executed over the weekend, they were tried in a closed military court. They did not have legal representation, so it is a major breach of their human rights. But I think that the reason why, and so another worrying thing is that 117 other activists currently have been sentenced to the death penalty, so I don't think that this will be the last execution that we see. But I think the reason why the Myanmar military has reintroduced the death penalty after 30 years, or more than 30 years, is that they want to instill fear in those that are continuing to resist the military regime. And, you know, our film, which you've just seen a little clip of, has shown that there's already many tactics that they are using to try and instill fear in the people of Myanmar.
We've yet to see a public statement from Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the National League for Democracy, and there will be those out there who say that she sort of, you know, she failed the people of Myanmar. I mean, I want to get on the ground. You spent, you know, a considerable amount of time there, living there, and you've made this film. What were the key takeaways for you?
On the ground?
Yeah.
Well, with regards to Aung San Suu Kyi, I think that the debate has, in some ways, has moved on from her now. The years that she was campaigning for democracy in Myanmar, she always pursued a sort of non-violent approach. But I think the people of Myanmar now have seen such horrors and experienced so many atrocities from the Myanmar military that they've decided that the only way that they can try and restore democracy is to fight back. And I think that she has dominated the political debate for so long, but actually now there are a lot of like young activists coming through with sort of new ideas which are actually you know, different to the one that she pursued. And so I actually think that you know, the political debate has sort of moved forward. But the people that we have filmed with, we filmed with a lot of these peaceful protesters who started off calling for democracy. They saw these mass shootings of protesters, of unarmed protesters, and then have fled to the jungles. And they are determined to eradicate the military institution once and for all.
How?
Through war, through guerrilla warfare. I mean, there are thousands of these young people who've fled to the ethnic areas along the Myanmar's border where they've received military training, and they're now trying to fight back. But obviously there's a huge discrepancy between the weapons that they have and the weapons that the Myanmar military are using. But despite that, they are actually achieving a number of successes. They are inflicting losses on the Myanmar military. I mean, it's difficult to get accurate numbers, but hundreds, if not thousands, of losses on the Myanmar military side. The groups that are aligned with these ethnic armed groups, they are making territorial gains. And perhaps most interestingly, these groups, they're called PDFs, or People's Defence Forces. They're across the entire country. They're all fighting back. The military is spread very thin as they're trying to suppress all of these groups. But they're really strong in central Myanmar, which doesn't have a history of resistance at all. And there, some of these groups have actually managed to wrest control away from the military and to set up their own sort of forms of governance and own sort of schools. And so the military is spread very thin. They're under pressure. And I think that is why you see them try and use even more brutal tactics to try and suppress the people. For example, the executions that we saw over the weekend.
If our viewers are watching this in the UK, they can see the documentary, which, as I say, is terrific, at 11:05 tonight, as I understand
That's
it,
right,
on Channel 4. What's the future for the country?
Well, it's a good question. So the military, not so long ago, they actually said that they hinted that they would entertain the idea of negotiations with Aung San Suu Kyi. And a number of international bodies, institutions have been pushing for negotiations. But some of those same institutions, and interestingly, sort of Cambodia, who's the head of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they've been wanting dialogue, they've been wanting negotiations, but they also said that they shouldn't execute these prisoners. And I think that the fact that the military went ahead and did it anyway shows that those sort of the door for negotiations are firmly closed and that they're not interested in it. I mean, there's the possibility of an internal military coup to try and get rid of Min Aung Hlaing and say that we're different now, but I'm not sure that will happen. And most importantly, these young people who have fled to the jungles and who are fighting back and fighting this guerrilla war, they are not going to give up until the military is fully eradicated. And so even if there are negotiations, even if Aung San Suu Kyi was released and she pushed for return to the status quo, I don't think that they are going to agree to that. And I think that it's going to be a long war, potentially a war of attrition.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's good to have you on. We will be right back.
We think of the metaverse as the next iteration of social media. And although there's only a few 100,000 people using it today, we anticipate that over the next few years, there's going to be millions of people joining these platforms and eventually billions of people using these platforms. This is not a fad. I mean, we can look at companies like Facebook doing the largest rebrand in history to Meta. We can look at companies like Samsung. Even the fashion brands like Gucci, Balenciaga, Adidas, and Nike are all establishing a presence there. And so what I would say to people that are still skeptical, say this is, maybe are the same type of people that were skeptical about social media and its impact on advertising, and maybe even people who are skeptical about the internet. My prediction is that within 24 months, every single large corporation is going to have to need a presence in the metaverse in the same way that they need a website.
There is nowhere in Lysychansk that's safe.
Let me show you what the scene looks like. It's absolutely obliterated. The force of that blast blowing out windows.
President Putin has been sending this message. He can hit this country anywhere, anytime.
Farmers are still working, even with the threat of Russian artillery that can land here.
Ukraine's message, please send more weapons.
In the United States, the White House is still deciding whether to declare monkeypox a public health emergency. Now, this comes a day after the World Health Organization did just that, calling the outbreak a global health emergency. More than 16,000 monkeypox cases have been reported in more than 70 countries, including around 2,900 in the US, according to the WHO. Well, our senior medical correspondent, Elizabeth Cohen, here to walk us through this. And this, of course, is hard news, or will be hard news for many people to take following 3 years in a pandemic. Let's just remind ourselves what monkeypox is and how concerned those watching this show should be.
So, Becky, I want to start by saying what monkeypox is not. It is not COVID. It does not spread nearly as easily as COVID. I mean, think about it. Monkeypox that's been around, it's been several months now. When we were several months into the COVID pandemic, it was, huge amounts all over the place. While there are many, many monkeypox cases, it is not spread the same way that COVID spread in those past few months. And nearly all of them, at least in the United States, have been among a very specific group, among men who have sex with men. That is not to say that this isn't important. Of course, that's not what we're saying. But just to make the point that this is not sort of growing like wildfire the way that COVID did. So let's take a look at some of those numbers that you were just talking about. When you look at COVID worldwide, you're seeing it in about 75 countries, nearly 17,000 cases. In the U.S., nearly 3,000 cases. In the U.S., at least 99% have reported male-to-male sexual contact. So a couple notes there. One, those two numbers you see, the 16,000, the 2,000, the numbers are almost certainly much, much higher than that. Another note is that while I say 99% in the U.S. have reported male-to-male sexual contact, that doesn't mean that you need to actually have sex, to have intercourse in order to get monkeypox. It can be spread by prolonged skin-to-skin contact. But note on the word prolonged. You don't get it by brushing up next to somebody. You're extremely unlikely to get it from, say, giving someone a hug. It is more from prolonged skin-to-skin contact. Becky?
What are the next steps in the United States and indeed globally? Do we know?
So the next steps are really, this is going to sound familiar because it was the same with COVID, is get as much testing as you can out there so that those who want to be tested will get tested, and also get a vaccine out there. So let's take a look at the progress with vaccines in the United States, because I think this shows you that we're not anywhere near where we want to be anywhere in the world. So in the U.S., 300,000 doses have been distributed, but 1.5 million people are eligible, meaning, for example, that they have had multiple partners, multiple male-to-male partners in places where monkeypox is spreading. So 1.5 million people, only 300,000 doses distributed, and each person needs 2 doses. So you can easily do the math there and see that we do not have what we need. And while we haven't looked into each of the 75 countries, I am imagining that it is the same situation in all of those as well. In the U.S., they're really trying to ramp it up, but they're sort of doing this from nothing. So it's going to take a little while until they get the numbers where they need to be.
Yeah, we're talking about, this being dealt with by ensuring that there are enough vaccines around for those who need them, correct?
Right, exactly. And in the United States, at least, the community, the gay community, has actually been very smart and very receptive towards vaccination on the whole. So that's a good thing. You're not trying to convince huge numbers of people who don't want to get vaccinated to get vaccinated. It's the opposite. They want this vaccine, and it's not there. The numbers are ramping up, and testing, which is also so important, those numbers have ramped up hugely as well, so that there's much less trouble getting a test than, say, in the early days of COVID.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
indeed.
Becky.
Elizabeth Cohen in the house for you. Former US Vice President Al Gore, one of the earliest well-known people to sound the alarm on climate change, is blasting climate deniers. He compared them to the police officers who failed to take action during the horrific school shooting in Uvalde in Texas. Have a listen.
You know, the climate deniers are really in some ways similar to all of those almost 400 law enforcement officers in Uvalde, Texas, who were waiting outside an unlocked door while the